Good afternoon. We'll continue on dealing with how Robert Baker considers slavery as part of a biblical society. This is how they try to justify slavery in the Confederacy, people, as a positive good, because God allowed slavery based on the hardness and wickedness of man's heart. And he wants to tell you Abraham had slaves in another video, because he had men servants and maid servants. He calls, see, if you see the word servant, now you see the word slave. So they start switching your mind, saying, well, God allows slavery, therefore we're servant, we're slaves, so therefore this is how. See, and Baker says, and Ruckman says, anybody who denounced slavery in the South, or South is right, oh, they didn't know what they're talking about, and they were, they were wicked, and bad Christians, and they don't know what they're talking about. That was practical. Paul was being practical about the situation a person found them in born in a society, the Roman Empire, where slavery was normal. And so you became a Christian either as a slave or as a owner slave. And so he was given out the practical application of how to live. That's not part of a biblical society, slavery. Paul was very practical. People were getting saved where one person in the family gets saved and the other person wouldn't be. So Paul gives the practical application of, well, if you're saved, don't marry an unbeliever, but if you're saved, the other person's an unbeliever, don't leave them. But if they walk away, you're allowed to marry. So there's a practical application. Is that the ideal? No. No, it's not the ideal, but it's a practical application of what was going on. What was going on, people back then were massive conversions, and people, one person in the family would be saved, the other person wouldn't be saved. And the person who wasn't saved would go back to their, go back to like, Oprah did in the book of Ruth, went back to gods, false gods. Didn't want to live as a Christian. Walked away. So Paul said, if you become a Christian, you're converted, and the other person is unsaved, you don't leave them for the sake of the children, even though you're unequally yoked. But if the other person leaves, don't stop them. Let them go. Now, is that ideal? No, it's not ideal. But it's practical. But this is more twisted thinking from these liars. 10 minutes in, 10:50 in.
Again, go back to Titus chapter 2 that we've already looked at. Titus chapter 2.
Remember, he said the ideal society was a Victorian period in 1800s. Which he means his ideal thing would be Confederacy. The South. He's not talking about the North, people.
This is called sound doctrine. Titus chapter 2, verse 3. The aged women likewise. And tells you what the aged women are supposed to do. The older women are supposed to teach younger women. Women are not supposed to teach men. But women, mothers, are supposed to teach their children, daughters, how they should obey their husbands in the future when they get married. That's all a part of sound doctrine. And then there it says in verse 9, exhort servants to be obedient to their own masters and to please them well in all things, not answering again. So over and over and over again, the doctrine that the Apostle Paul tells us is the doctrine of the church age is the husband is a type of Christ and should be honored as we honor Jesus. The woman is a type of the church, and the husband should honor his wife and love his wife and sacrifice, be willing to die for his wife just as Christ died for the church. Now she's to submit to her husband just as we are to submit to Jesus Christ. And if they have children, those children are to honor their parents, obey their parents, and do what their parents say. And if that family unit has servants and slaves.
If that family unit has servants and what? Slaves?
Willing to die for his wife just as Christ died for the church. Now she's to submit to her husband just as we are to submit to Jesus Christ. And if they have children, those children are to honor their parents, obey their parents, and do what their parents say. And if that family unit has servants and slaves, then those slaves are supposed to obey their masters. Today we don't
Why would a Christian family have slaves, people? Get that? This is all Christian. This is all in the context of being a Christian. Here's a guy telling you he wouldn't want to own a slave. And yet he's telling you that in the context of being a Christian, if that family had slaves, these slaves are supposed to operate a certain way. But here's a man, oh, I wouldn't want to be a slave or own a slave. And yet, that's what the Confederates did. So he has to say, well, why would you not want to own a slave, Robert? Why wouldn't you want to not own a slave? He's giving you the ideal, people, that slavery is part of a biblical society.
slaves anymore, and thank God.
Thank God. Well, you just made an ideal. You said the 1800s, Robert. They existed in the 1800s. You want to go back to the 1800s. Now you're saying, thank God they don't exist anymore. Why? You said God allows it. Why? Why is it bad? Why? You double talker?
Like I said, I'm not a fan of slavery.
I'm not a fan of slavery. But you say it's part of the biblical society. You say it's part of the biblical society. And therefore, in a Christian scenario here, the slaves are supposed to act according to the way we set up a Christian setup, a Christian ideal. And he'd want to go back to the 1800s, where slavery did exist. And he'd want to go back to the South, where slavery did exist.
But slavery was allowed in the Bible.
Yeah, so what? That doesn't make it the ideal. You said you want to be a slave or own a slave. Just because it's allowed doesn't mean it's good. This is what these guys say. So if you denounce slavery as being wicked, you're saying, well, God allows it, so it can't be wicked. No, we denounce divorce too. And God allows it under certain circumstances. But it's not the ideal.
It was part of God's doctrine. Now notice what I showed you today.
Slavery is part of God's doctrine. Hear that, people? Now you just got that. 1231 in. It's part of God's doctrine. Part of the doctrine that Paul is talking about is how you treat your slaves in a pagan society. Not a Christian one. Not a Christian one, people. A Christian should not own slaves. You lying fraud. You said you want to own slaves. But now he's telling you this is part of Christian doctrine. So if you denounce slavery, as being evil, they come back and say, oh no, God allows it. Well, it doesn't matter. God allows it. It's still evil. He said, well, if it's God allows it, why don't you want to have slaves, Robert? Why don't you want to have it? He's going to set up the biblical society was the Confederacy. And since they allowed slaves, it was okay. It was a positive good. Even though Robert keeps saying, oh, he hates slavery. He would never want to be a slave. He would never want to own a slave. But he would, if he was in the South, in the Confederacy, 1800s, where he says the ideal, he wouldn't denounce it from the pulpit as being non-Christian. He wouldn't denounce it. He'd say, well, God allows it. And then, of course, what did he do in the other video? Try to turn the word servant into slave. So you're supposed to believe Abraham had slaves, not servants. Because they're supposed to be synonymous. See how this guy's mind works? You see how the whole PPI mind works? This Ruckman's mind? Something allowed now becomes something good. Even though they wouldn't want it. They always got to put that in there. And remember, the Confederacy was the first nation, quote unquote, that made slavery racial. Racial. And their constitution says Negro slavery. But he considers that part of a biblical society. If it's a biblical society and it's running according to Christian principles, people, it wouldn't have any slavery. If a society is being run according to Christian principles, you get rid of slavery. He wants you to believe that the Confederacy is being run along Christian principles because of the dominance of Christianity in the South. But that's why the denominations split over it, because the northern denomination said, you can't have slavery as Christians. You can't own slaves. It's contradictory. And they say, oh no, we're allowed to own slaves. It's a positive good. It's good for slaves. That's their reason. Well, if it's good for if slavery is good, then you shouldn't be saying I don't want to own slaves. Now, back then, Lincoln would always quip about that and say, people always told me how positive slavery was. It helped, the African was much better off as a slave and that type of thing. He said, well, I never hear a white man talking about wanting to be a slave. But they use the Bible, which is what Blake is doing here, people, to justify owning slaves. That's why he's got to sneak slavery in the word servant under there. He has to justify owning slaves. And that's what the whole thing comes back around to the Confederacy, people. His great-grandfather did not denounce slavery from the pulpit because the next verse talks about you don't have wholesome words. You don't have anybody who disagrees that slavery is okay. And let that believing masters, let them not despise them because they are brethren, but rather do them service because they are faithful and beloved partakers of the benefit. These things teach and exhort. Verse 3, if any man teach otherwise, and consent not to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine, which is according to godliness, he is proud, knowing nothing, but throwing about questions, strifes of words, whereof cometh envy, strife, railings, evil surmisings, perverse disputings of men, etc., etc. So they take the idea that God allows slavery, and that if you denounce it, those verses there are telling how you're supposed to, a slave and a master are supposed to interact in a culture that allows slavery. It's not telling you that in a Christian culture, that's the way it should be. As a Christian, you shouldn't be owning slaves. In a Christian culture, because what did Robert say? Oh, he would never own a slave. Robert says he would never want to own a slave. So why were Christians owning slaves, Robert? Why were Christians owning slaves if you said you would never want to own a slave? You hypocrite. And then they pull verse 3 on you. And that's where they go to Confederacy. Say, well, see, if you, this is doctrine, people, and we know what it says there. We know that the issue is that Paul's writing a practical application of a slave-master relationship. But he's talking in a pagan society where Christians often could not release their slaves because of difficulty in doing so. But if you're talking about a Christian society, it should be very easy to release your slaves, as it was before 1840 in the South. Guess what? The Union of the North, the North had people. They freed those slaves up there. It was easier. But 1840, 1860, it was very difficult to free the slaves. You had to go through a lot because they didn't want these people freed. They didn't want that as an example. So the slave owners always went to these verses, people, to justify owning other people. And then they went to the Old Testament and tell you manservants and maidservants mean slaves. Abraham. And then you're the one who's not holding up, who's going against doctrine. You're the one who rejects the idea. When Robin himself says, I would never want to own a slave. Well, when Grant inherited his slave, he let him go. Sometimes you get a slave as inheritance, for instance, in those cases. His wife, I think, inherited the woman, a woman. You free her. You don't want to own slaves? You free them. That's the biblical society. The biblical society. Christians interacting among each other, husband, wives, children, interacting among themselves as Christians, right? But no, we get the slaves and says, well, and the Christian can keep owning his slaves? Oh, no. Unless under conditions where the government wouldn't let him free him, which is what at Rome was very difficult to free slaves. And in the South, from 1840 on, likewise. It was very difficult because of society to free a slave. But that didn't make it ideal. That didn't make it right. That didn't make it part of a biblical society. That made it part of a secular society that was determined to hold on to slavery. So this is what you get with this guy. This is what the lies, this is what the whole issue is about, and this is why they make this stuff up. And you're reading the same verses they're reading, and you see where these guys go off their rocker. And you're not supposed to denounce them as liars when they are liars. I would never own a slave. You would own, back in the Confederacy, where you want to be, you in Florida, you wouldn't denounce slavery. And the application there is practical application. Paul's living in a society that accepted slavery as the norm. And it was very difficult for Christians to free their slaves. Very difficult. And that's what the secular society does. It's a secular issue. Are you going to free, how are you going to, get rid of, be able to release these slaves? But it wasn't a good thing. So Paul's talking about the relationship. If you find yourself as a slave, or you find yourself as a master, this is how you're supposed to behave. He's not saying it's a positive good. That the institution or that relationship is a good thing. He's just saying this is how you should act, given the available issues. That if you find yourself in a situation that a society accepts slavery as a norm, and you can't either remove yourself as a slave, or the master can't free you, this is how the relationship should be. But that's not supposed to be, it's not ideal. It's not the ideal. And the Christian should free their slaves. Because what did Robert say? He didn't want to own a slave. Well, why did these other guys want to own slaves? That you claim are Christians. All these Christians say, well, why don't you want to own a slave and these guys do? We'll stop, put this up. Amen. Thank you.